My friend David's wife asked me at dinner last fall whether they were idiots for keeping $42,000 in a regular savings account. They both have decent jobs. They've been maxing their 401ks for years. The 42 grand was just sitting there, technically earning a little over 4% in a high-yield account, and their financial advisor had been telling them, gently but clearly, that they were leaving money on the table. They wanted to know if he was right. The honest answer to that question is more complicated than either side of the cash debate wants to admit. The "you're losing to inflation" crowd is calculating one side of the ledger. The "cash is king" crowd is calculating the other side. Almost nobody runs both columns. And until you do, you can't actually answer the question that matters, which is whether the cash sitting in your account is doing more for you than it's costing you. That's what this video is about. The honest math on both sides. I'm Tom. This channel is about real personal finance for normal people. No motivational fluff, no fantasy returns. Just what the math actually does over time. If that's what you want, hit subscribe. Here's where I'm going to take you. First, what cash actually costs you, with real numbers, including the part the cash skeptics overstate badly. Then, what cash actually buys you, also with real numbers, including the part the cash defenders never bother to quantify. Then, I'll tell you about a guy I used to commute with who held too much cash for too long, because that story is the part of this conversation almost nobody on YouTube is willing to tell. By the end, you'll have a clean way to answer the question for your own situation. Let's start with the cost side, because that's the side most people quote first and almost always get wrong. The standard pitch from the deploy everything crowd goes like this. The S&P 500 has returned roughly 10% a year historically. A high-yield savings account pays you a little over 4% today. So every dollar you keep in cash is costing you somewhere around 6% a year in foregone returns. Hold $50,000 in cash for a decade, and you're missing out on tens of thousands of dollars. That math is real on a long-run average. What the pitch leaves out is the shape of the returns underneath that average. The 10% annual return on the S&P is an average across roughly a century of data, and averages hide what the year-to-year experience actually looks like. The S&P 500 has been negative in about 1 out of every 4 years going back to 1928. In those years, you don't pay any drag for holding cash, you collect it. Cash beat stocks by roughly 40 percentage points in 2008. Cash beat stocks by about 20 percentage points in 2022. There are similar years scattered through the historical record. The drag is real over a multi-decade horizon. It is nothing close to a steady annual bleed. The other thing the standard pitch leaves out is inflation. A 4% yield with inflation running around 2.5% leaves you with roughly 1.5% of real return. Slow growth, but you're not bleeding either. So the honest framing of the cost side is this. Over a long horizon, the average drag on cash relative to stocks is real, somewhere in the 4 to 6% range nominally. But you don't actually pay that drag in any predictable, even way. A quarter of the time you're collecting. The rest of the time you're paying. And the pitch from the deploy everything crowd treats the average as if it were a guaranteed monthly bill, which it isn't. There is a second cost almost nobody talks about though, and I've watched it play out in 2 or 3 friends. When you carry a lot of cash, you start telling yourself that you're already doing the responsible thing. Your 401k contribution rate stops climbing. Your IRA gets maxed less consistently. You feel like a careful person because there's a big number in your savings account. Meanwhile, the tax-advantaged retirement space you let expire each April is gone forever. Call this the comfort drift. It doesn't show up on any spreadsheet. Over a decade, it quietly subtracts more from your wealth than the inflation drag ever does. That's the honest cost side. A real long-run drag against an aggressive alternative, plus a behavioral risk you have to actively manage. Now let's run the other column. The other side of this ledger almost never gets quantified honestly. The cash defenders talk about options and freedom and agency, all of which are real things, but they're so abstract they're basically impossible to argue with on either side. Let me try to put real numbers on what cash actually buys. The first thing it buys is the ability to close fast on a transaction, and the data here is sharper than most people realize. Property data firm Cotality looked at all cash home purchases in 2025 and found that all cash buyers paid about 9% less on average than buyers using a mortgage. That's up from 4% in 2021. On a $400,000 home, 9% is roughly $36,000 saved on a single transaction. The seller takes less money because cash closes in days instead of weeks, and there's no risk of the deal collapsing at the financing stage. That same dynamic shows up everywhere there's a motivated seller. A neighbor offloading a used car who needs the money by Friday. A small landlord trying to sell a rental property quickly. A friend closing a side venture who needs the capital out by month end. In all of those situations, certainty has a price, and the buyer who can write a check captures it. The second thing cash buys is the ability to avoid forced selling, which is the single most expensive event in personal investing, and the one almost no calculator factors in. The pattern is simple. Markets drop. Around the same time, something in your life goes wrong, and the most common version is a job loss. But it can just as easily be a medical bill or a roof that picks the worst possible week to fail. You don't have cash. So you sell shares at a 15 or 30% discount to where they were last year. You lock in a loss permanently. You miss the rebound that follows. The $40,000 you had to pull out didn't just cost you $40,000. It cost you what those shares would have been worth when the market came back, which on a fast rebound like 2020 was easily another $20,000 or $30,000 on top. The cost of that single moment can erase a decade of careful investing. The way you avoid it is by having cash already sitting there, so the moment never becomes a forced sale in the first place. The third thing cash buys is harder to quantify, but probably worth more than the first two combined. Call it negotiating posture. When you can walk away from any individual conversation, every conversation goes better. When you can't, every conversation goes worse. That's true with employers, it's true with contractors, it's true with car dealers, with landlords, with anyone you ever negotiate anything with. My retired neighbor Paul is a good example of this. He kept about 18 months of expenses sitting in a money market account for most of his working life, which his coworkers thought was a little odd, because Paul was working a state government job in the mid $50,000 range and didn't have any obvious reason to need that much cash on hand. But Paul told me once that when his department restructured in his mid-40s and they tried to push him into a role he didn't want, he was able to say no. He told them what role he would take instead. They gave it to him. He thinks that single conversation moved his salary trajectory permanently, probably to the tune of $7,000 or $8,000 a year for the rest of his working career, compounded through his eventual pension calculation. The cash didn't directly earn him that money. The cash made the conversation possible. Without it, he would have taken the role they offered him and never known there was a better version. Now multiply Paul's one conversation across a working life. You push back on a contractor quote you'd otherwise just take, because losing the negotiation wouldn't actually hurt you. When a lowball offer comes in, you have the patience to wait for a better one instead of grabbing whatever's on the table because you have to. An unexpected bill lands and you cover it in cash instead of carrying it on a credit card at the current average rate of about 24% for the next 8 months. Each of those decisions feels small in the moment. The compounding effect of making thousands of them from a position of strength instead of fear is enormous. And it's the part of this conversation that conventional finance content has no idea how to value. I want to be honest about the other side of this though, because I have also watched what happens when somebody holds too much cash for too long. This is the part of the cash conversation almost nobody on YouTube is willing to tell, because it doesn't fit the cash is king narrative. A few years ago, I used to commute occasionally with a guy I'll call Greg. Greg was maybe 10 years older than me, worked at a healthcare company, made decent money, and had been convinced from around the mid-2000s 10 onward that the stock market was overvalued and a major crash was coming. He kept roughly $180,000 in cash, waiting for the right moment to deploy. I lost touch with Greg for a few years. When I ran into him again pretty recently, the subject came up. He still had most of that cash. He'd put a chunk to work in March 2020 when the market dropped, but only about a third of his pile, because he was sure the bottom wasn't really in yet. The rest sat there through the entire recovery. If Greg had simply put that $180,000 into a broad market index fund back when he started this strategy and never touched it, it would have been worth somewhere north of $500,000 by the time we caught up. Instead, after his partial deployment in 2020, he was sitting closer to $300,000. The patience cost him roughly $250,000 across about a decade. The lesson isn't that Greg's instinct was wrong. The lesson is that an offensive cash position is only useful if you actually deploy it. Cash held in case of an opportunity becomes wealth destroying if the opportunity never comes, or if you let perfection be the enemy of action. Greg was waiting for the bottom. The bottom doesn't ring a bell when it arrives. Most people, including Greg, including me, cannot reliably identify it in real time. So the cash defenders are right that having dry powder is valuable. There's a hidden requirement they tend to skip, which is that you actually have to use it. If you're going to hold 30 or 50 or 100,000 in cash for opportunities, you need to be honest with yourself about whether you're the kind of person who will actually pull the trigger when the moment shows up. Some people are, some people aren't. Knowing which one you are matters more than knowing the theoretical right amount. So how much cash should you hold? Most personal finance content gives you a fixed answer, like 3 months, or 6 months, or 1 year, as if every viewer is the same person. They aren't. Here's how I'd actually think about it. The first layer, the truly non-negotiable one, is enough to absorb a real-world emergency without going into debt. The Bureau of Labor Statistics puts average household spending around $6,500 a month, but your stripped down monthly survival number, just housing, food, utilities, insurance, and minimum debt payments, is usually closer to $4,000 for most households. 3 to 6 months of that stripped down number is your floor. That puts most households somewhere between $12,000 and $24,000. This layer is not where you optimize for yield. It's just supposed to exist and to never be touched except when something actually goes wrong. The second layer, beyond that floor, is where the conversation gets interesting and where almost everyone settles in the wrong place. The right number depends on 3 things about your specific situation. How stable is your income? A W-2 employee with strong benefits at a stable company can hold less than a self-employed person, a commissioned salesperson, or someone in a layoff-prone industry. The harder it is to replace your income quickly, the more cash you need behind you. How far are you from retirement? Someone 20 years from the end of their working life can hold less cash than someone 5 years out, because the time you have to recover from a bad event is much longer at 35 than at 60. And whether you actually deploy cash for opportunities or just sit on it. The Greg test. If you're a deployer, holding more cash makes real sense because you'll actually use it. If you're a hoarder, the extra cash will just sit there and cost you the drag. For most stable W-2 households in their 30s and 40s, the honest answer is somewhere in the range of 6 to 12 months of stripped down expenses, plus whatever specific opportunity capital you actually plan to put to work in the next 2 or 3 years. For most people, that comes out to somewhere between $20,000 and $70,000 total in cash, not more in most cases. The bigger numbers some creators throw around, 2 or 3 years of expenses, are usually right for self-employed people, late career people, or people with specific deal making in their financial lives. They are not right for everyone. Once you've decided how much, the where is simple. The FDIC national savings average right now is 38 basis points. That is effectively zero. The top high yield accounts are paying somewhere between 4 and 4.5%, with a couple of outliers a bit higher. Marcus by Goldman Sachs, Ally, SoFi, Wealthfront, Capital One 360. Pick one. Open the account in 15 minutes. Move the cash. On $20,000, the difference between the national average and a top high yield rate is close to $800 a year. That's free money you're leaving on the table for no reason other than inertia. If you want to go one step further, treasury bills are worth knowing about. Similar yield range as the top savings accounts, but the interest is exempt from state and local income tax, which actually matters if you live somewhere like California or New York. You can buy them directly through Treasury Direct or through your broker. Not life-changing, but a real edge if you're holding meaningful cash and live in a high-tax state. Here's what I want you to take from this video. The cash debate is usually framed as if there's a single right answer that applies to everyone. There isn't. There's an honest ledger with 2 columns. Cash has a cost that is smaller than the deploy everything crowd suggests. Cash has a benefit that is more concrete than the cash is king crowd ever bothers to quantify. The right amount for your situation depends on which side of the ledger you can actually use. What I told David's wife at dinner was that $42,000 in their savings account was probably about right for their situation. They were both stable W-2 earners in mid-career, with no specific deal flow they were waiting to act on, and plenty of tax advantage space they were already filling. That $42,000 was buying them about 6 months of breathing room and the negotiating posture that comes with it. The long-run cost of carrying it versus a fully invested alternative is real, somewhere around $2,000 a year in expected drag. The breathing room and the negotiating posture are worth more than that to them at this stage of their life. That's a trade I'd take every time. If you want me to walk through the specific account types and tax efficiency moves you should run on the cash you're holding right now, I made a video on this channel called The Smartest Order to Invest Your Money that covers the full sequence. Watch that next. Drop a comment with how much cash you're holding right now and what you think you're using it for. I read every one.